Welcome to my channel. Make sure you hit the like button, share, and subscribe. This is part 7 of the Boobie Boys. Preparing for the continuing criminal enterprise, CCE indictments, was tedious and time-consuming. Chris Clark made a tactical decision to concentrate solely on the Boobie Boys for the CCE and dismantle Vonda's gang with firearms and narcotics violations. If the Boobie Boys case was successful, they planned to initiate a similar CCE for Vonda's gang. In a little over 1 year, the task force had interviewed hundreds of witnesses and pulled out the weak or undesirable ones. Even so, they still presented 120 witnesses to the grand jury. Each witness that made the cut had to be re-interviewed 2 or 3 times. And with information obtained from each witness, the case expanded even more. Each potential witness had to be vetted for Giglio and Brady violations, 2 Supreme Court decisions that pertained to witness testimony. In Giglio versus United States, the court held that the jury must be informed of any promises made to the witness in exchange for his or her testimony. This was fairly straightforward. The Brady decision, though, was more complicated. Brady versus Maryland, 1963, was a landmark decision in which the court ruled that the prosecutor must turn over to the defense any evidence that might tend to exonerate a defendant. This is known as exculpatory evidence. For example, evidence that is favorable to the defendant and could possibly sway a jury to find him not guilty. The facts of the Brady case are interesting. In 1958, John Brady and Charles Bartlett killed William Brooks. Brady admitted being involved, but claimed that it was Bartlett who did the actual killing. Brady said they stole Brooks' car to use in a bank robbery. They placed a log across the road leading to Brooks' house, and when Brooks got out of his car to move the log, they hit him over the head with a shotgun. They drove him to a secluded area where either Brady or Bartlett strangled Brooks to death with a shirt. After being arrested, they both gave several different statements in which the facts changed repeatedly. However, Brady consistently denied killing Brooks and always maintained that it was Bartlett who strangled him. Prior to Brady's murder trial, Brady's lawyer asked the prosecutor for any admissions either of the men had made. The prosecutor turned over all Bartlett's statements except one, in which he confessed to killing the victim. Both Brady and Bartlett were convicted in separate trials and sentenced to death. The Maryland Court of Appeals held that suppression by the prosecutor of evidence favorable to the accused violates due process. The United States Supreme Court concurred and said that the Constitution requires the disclosure of exculpatory evidence. Over the years, thousands of felons have been released from prison due to Brady violations that were uncovered after they were convicted. The interpretation of what is considered exculpatory is ambiguous. Any prior arrests must be disclosed. If the witness ever used an alias or gave the wrong date of birth to the police, this could be considered lying and something the jury should know about. If the witness ever denied the charges against him in court and was later convicted, that could be considered as lying under oath. Their witnesses were certainly not saints, and for them, lying to the police was a way of life. Chris Clark and Officer Tony spent countless hours combing the arrest affidavits and police reports, trying to find information that needed to be disclosed. The discovery material they had to furnish to the defense lawyers became massive. They had to make copies of everything and then use a Bates stamp to mark the pages. A Bates stamp sequentially numbers all the documents. Starting at 0, The stamp advances by 1 digit each time it is pressed down on the page and leaves an inked imprint of that number. By the time of the trial, they had turned over tens of thousands of pages of material. The volume of paperwork they were generating was becoming problematic. Sergeant Dave Simmons had created files on all of their targets and witnesses, and by mid-May, he was up to 600 folders. They didn't have enough space to accommodate all their files and evidence. Chris Clark convinced the marshals to allow them to occupy a windowless room in the old courthouse known as the Igloo. It was called the Igloo because it was a room that was always cold. Even on the hottest Miami days, the air conditioner pumped Arctic frigid air out of the vents until it felt like they were in, well, an igloo. They called it their war room. On May 6, 1999, the Boobie Boys grand jury returned an 18-count CCE indictment naming 15 defendants: Kenneth Williams, aka Boobie, Efrain Casado, aka E4, Leonard Brown, aka Bo, Leonard Brown, aka Nard, Susan Hall Gibson, aka Miss Sue, Bernard Shaw, Marvin Baker, Malcolm Shaw, aka Rat, Ronald Ray, aka Rollo, Wayne Baptiste, aka Fat Wayne, Michael Harper, aka Chico, Arthur Pless, aka Plex, Ben Johnson, aka Bush, Jonathan Hawthorne, aka Moose, and Charlton Dackleys, aka Flav. Included in the formal accusation were 15 murders. The names of the victims are listed as Benny Brownlee, Walter Betterson, Derek Young, Everett Cooper, Otis Green, Alice Gardner, Michael Frazier, 5 years of age, Moses Brown, Tarvis Miller, Johnny Belliard, Roger Davis, Tyrone Tarver, Alvin Kelly, Roosevelt Davis, and John Davis Jr. The indictment was signed by the foreperson of the grand jury and by the Assistant United States Attorneys Chris Clark, Bruce Brown, and Stacey Levin. It was the culmination of a year and a half of incredibly hard work. The members of the task force were elated, but they also knew that there was a lot more work to do. They had to find all the mutts and arrest them, then prepare for the eventual trial. They spent the weekend planning for the arrests. DEA agents, ATF agents, and Miami-Dade plainclothes and uniform personnel were assigned to teams responsible for hitting the houses of each of the 11 individuals who were still at large. E4, Flav, Bo, and Nard were already in custody. They struck at dawn, conducting coordinated raids. In his book Street Kings of Miami, Seth Ferranti describes the takedowns this way. The feds were all over them. They came at them hard. First they swept through Little River. Then they shook down Liberty City. At the same time, they were in Carroll City. The raids were simultaneous, involving all branches of the government law enforcement agencies. All the alphabet boys came out. By the time they got finished locking people up, questioning them, and inflicting their Gestapo tactics, the Boobie Boys were done. They went from running the streets to being confined in jail cells. The Boobie Boys were down but not out. They were getting ready to rumble with the feds in federal court. The United States of America versus the Boobie Boys. It would be their toughest battle yet. With the feds, there was no quarter given, no quarter taken. The rough streets of Miami had left the Boobie Boys battle-tested, but now they would have their hands full with the feds. They were guerrillas in the street, but the feds were top dogs in their world. The gang and the government weren't so different. Seth Ferranti is an ex-con who spent 21 years of a 25-year sentence in federal prison for possession of LSD. While locked up, he earned 3 college degrees, including his master's. In prison, he wrote 22 books about street gangsters, drug lords, and prison gangs. His writing is obviously anti-government and highly sympathetic to the convicts who make up the overwhelming majority of his readers. He wrote, produced, and appeared in the Netflix documentary White Boy Rick. Officer Tony was on the team that was assigned to arrest Ronald Ray. They woke him out of a sound sleep, and when he realized what he was being charged with, he started shaking like a wet dog. At one point, Officer Tony thought he might pass out. I knew there was no way he would hold up, and I was right, Officer Tony said. Rollo was the first one to flip. They took him back to the DEA office in the Koger Center and learned that the other teams had captured Wayne Baptiste, the twins' mother, Susan Hall Gibson, the cop Marvin Baker, Malcolm Shaw, Arthur Pless, and Ben Johnson, who was in a wheelchair. Later that day, Bernard Shaw surrendered himself to Officer Tony at his lawyer's office in Fort Lauderdale, and Jonathan Hawthorne was apprehended in Overtown. Officer Tony tried to talk to Moose Hawthorne because he had been somewhat cooperative when he interviewed him months earlier, but he was not very friendly this time. He told Officer Tony, "Man, get out of my face with that Homer Simpson-style voice you got." Only Boobie and Michael, Chico Harper, were still on the loose. They still couldn't find Boobie. Dozens of tips came in, but they always seemed to be a step behind him. They stopped cars, kicked in doors, and surveyed his known haunts, but he remained a fugitive. They needed help, and the United States Marshal Service agreed to detach Deputy Marshal Mike Moran to the task force to track him down. Mike was a wizard at tracing cell phones and prepaid phone cards. He immediately determined that Boobie was using burner phones, which would make it hard to find him, but not impossible. Officer Tony had worked with Mike before on homicide cases and had complete confidence in him. He was a bulldog who never gave up. Officer Tony knew with Mike after him, it would just be a matter of time before Boobie would be in custody. The U.S. Marshal Service has a storied history. It is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in existence, created in 1789 during the presidency of George Washington. Their main responsibility is the protection of judges and judicial personnel, as well as the apprehension of fugitives from justice. They are also tasked with operating the Federal Witness Protection Program, the execution of federal warrants, and the transportation of federal prisoners. During the 19th century, U.S. Marshals were the only source of law enforcement throughout vast areas of the western United States. Many of those marshals are legends today, revered for their unwavering stance against lawlessness. While Mike was working the phones, Officer Tony got a call from Carol Mill Francis. She said she had just gotten off the phone with Boobie, who told her he was willing to turn himself in within 7 days, but only if all charges against the twins were dropped. When Officer Tony scoffed and told her that such an arrangement was out of the question, she said, "Well, isn't it worth 2 or 3 policemen not getting hurt or killed to let the twins off?" Officer Tony couldn't contain his anger. He told her that was an outrageous statement and that it almost sounded like a threat. They were on a taped line, and Officer Tony hoped she would go further. He accused her of being bamboozled by her clients, and she replied, No, that's not so. I know exactly what Boobie is capable of, and I'm sure most of what you have accused him of is true." She also said that she didn't know where Boobie was hiding, but even if she did, she wouldn't tell him. Mike Moran was closing in on Boobie. He told him about the call Boobie had made to Mills Francis. He had been able to identify Bernard Shaw's cell phone as well as the cell phone of one of Boobie's girlfriends named Nicole. He said it appeared Boobie was hiding somewhere near Atlanta, but he was still trying to isolate the exact location. On May 17, 1999, exactly a year and 1 week after the publication of the Mother's Day article in the Miami Herald, Officer Tony was leaving the federal courthouse when his cell phone rang. The display told him it was Mike Moran. "We got him. We got Boobie," he said excitedly. "You're the first person who knows. I wanted to call you first." Boobie was handcuffed behind his back, so he put the cell phone up to his ear and said, "Say hi to Sergeant Monheim." Boobie refused to talk to Officer Tony. All he heard him say was, "Nah, man, I don't want to talk to that cracker." Mike came back on the phone. "We got him leaving a house just outside of Atlanta. He had 2 kilos and 2 Glocks with him. The big tough guy gangster peed on himself when we drew down on him." On December 17, 1999, during a routine bed check, corrections officers at FDC found one of the twins, Nard Brown, dead in his cell. He had succumbed to an apparent heart attack. He was 21 years old. Various informants had previously told them that Nard suffered from rheumatic heart disease and required a monthly shot at Jackson Memorial Hospital to ward off heart infections. He had rheumatic fever as a kid that damaged his heart valves. An autopsy revealed severe scarring and damage to his heart muscle, as well as a faulty mitral valve. A month prior to his death, Nard was mistakenly put in the same cell as Rara. As soon as the corrections officers walked away, Rara pounced on him. Nard frantically crawled under a bunk bed, trying to get away from Rara, but he grabbed him by the ankle and pulled him out. Nard screamed for the guards, while Rara punched and kicked him. He was finally rescued and taken to the infirmary for treatment of his injuries. It is doubtful that the beating inflicted by Rara had anything to do with Nard's demise weeks later, but Rara bragged to other inmates that it was the ass whipping he gave Nard that caused his death. Attorneys for Miss Sue, Nard's mother, and Bo, Nard's brother, filed motions requesting that they be allowed to attend the funeral. Prosecutor Chris Clark opposed the motions, but was agreeable to Miss Sue attending a private viewing at the Potier Funeral Home, only if she was accompanied by U.S. Marshals. Because Bo was such a huge escape risk, Chris was averse to any type of funeral accommodations for him. In the end, Bo's request was denied, and Miss Sue was escorted by the Marshals to the funeral home for a private viewing. Rara decided to work out the best deal he could for himself and his wife Andrea. Andrea agreed to plead guilty to the trafficking charges in Macon, Georgia. She had a gun in the car along with several kilos when she was arrested, so that bumped it up to armed trafficking. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Prior to her sentencing, she told Detective Chuck Clark about an incident in Madison County, Florida, where the sheriff's office stopped her and found 2 handguns in her vehicle. One was a .25 caliber pistol and the other was a 9mm Taurus. She said the 9mm was the gun that was used to kill Bear. This was the gun Rara had given to Rasheen to kill William Eland, but Rasheen killed Bear by mistake. Chuck had the Madison County Sheriff's Office test fire the weapon and FedEx 3 projectiles and casings to him. They were a match to the bullets removed from Bear's head at his autopsy and the casings found on the scene. Rara entered a guilty plea to the firearms charges the task force had filed in April of 1998. He had already been sentenced to 20 years in Macon and federal judge Edward Davis added another 15 to that sentence to be served consecutively. This meant he would serve a total of 35 years, and he still had the state charges for the murder of Marvin Rogers to worry about. In a plea agreement drafted by Miami-Dade Assistant State's Attorney Mike Spivak, Rara agreed to plead guilty to the murder of Rogers and receive a 20-year sentence that would run concurrent with his federal time. That is, if he testified truthfully against his co-defendants, Andre McWhorter, Bam, and Jamal Brown, Pukalata. He also agreed to name Vonda Jackson as the person who paid for the hit. For the first time, he acknowledged in the plea agreement that it was Vonda who paid him to kill McBride. Rara had forewarned Vonda about his intentions. In a rambling letter, he threatened to expose her unless she sent him $5,000. Vonda turned the letter over to her probation officer, who forwarded a copy to Officer Tony. It is 3 pages long, but the pertinent section is near the end. It read, "Black girl, I'm asking you to come up with $5,000 to go to fight for my freedom, or else I'm going to take the easy way out by telling everything I know about you and all the killing you hired me to do, which is a total of 4. Not to mention how your lover killed Cabo in front of your drug spot. Don't make me go there, cause we both know I've got enough to put you on death row. So if I'm gonna die in here, then we will both die together. Now you can take this as a joke, as if the whole thing is a game, but I promise you will regret it later when you see me sitting on that stand." After the plea agreement had been signed in front of Judge Gerald Bogley, ASA Spivak asked if Officer Tony would take a formal statement from Rara that described the murder of Marvin Rogers in detail. 2 days later, Officer Tony drove homicide stenographer Joanne Barry to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Officer Tony made prior arrangements with the marshals to have Rara brought to one of the vacant grand jury rooms. Rara was escorted in by 3 U.S. Marshals. He was wearing a red jumpsuit with his feet shackled and was secured with belly chain handcuffs. He was ushered to a chair by the marshals, who eyed him warily. As Joanne set up her steno machine, Officer Tony opened the Marvin Rogers case file and began leafing through the reports and the crime scene pictures. When Rara saw the photos, he said, "Hey man, can I see those?" Officer Tony had intended to show them to him during his statement anyway, so he let him look at them. When he saw the photo of Marvin Rogers laying on his side with most of his face blown off, he smiled. "That's some of my handiwork right there," he said gleefully. Rara had a deep baritone voice. He sounded a lot like Barry White, the singer. Officer Tony had talked to him on the phone several times, but this was the first time he spoke to him in person. As he recounted the murder of Marvin Rogers, he became animated and appeared to relish reliving it. It was a chilling narrative, and he told it with delight. He definitely reveled in the retelling of how Rogers' face exploded when he fired the AK into the back of his head. When he finished, Officer Tony saw the marshals shaking their heads in disbelief and disgust. After the marshals took Rara back, Joanne and Officer Tony rode the elevator down to the lobby, and she was uncharacteristically quiet. As they were driving back to the headquarters building, she stared straight ahead. Finally, she said, "Oh my God, isn't that the most horrible person you have ever met? He is pure evil." Rara proved to be a formidable witness. Bam and Pukalata were both convicted of first-degree murder. Bam was sentenced to 22 years in state prison, and Pukalata to 20. Vonda was never charged by the state in the Marvin Rogers murder. Rara was Vonda's main enforcer and hitman, of course, but she had others. One was her boyfriend, Antron Davis, known as Tron. Since their love was eternal, Vonda had the tattoo Tron emblazoned on her chest, and he had Vonda displayed on his. He also had For Life tattooed on the side of his neck. Not only was Tron one of Vonda's enforcers, but he was also a lieutenant in her drug organization and distribution network. Tron was one of their first targets, and an indictment for the federal charge of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon was obtained earlier on. That indictment stemmed from a traffic stop that was conducted by the City of Miami Police Department. Tron was driving a Chevrolet Suburban registered to Dale Carter, a cornerback for the NFL Denver Broncos. In the Suburban, police discovered a .45 caliber automatic pistol, and he was arrested. The charges were dropped by the state attorney's office, of course, but refiled at the federal level by Chris Clark and ATF agent Carlos Canino. When the task force, accompanied by a bevy of ATF agents, swarmed an apartment in Overtown and arrested Tron, he was in possession of an AR-15 rifle and a 12-gauge pump shotgun. As a 5-time convicted felon, he was not allowed to possess any firearms, so additional charges were filed. During an interview at the ATF field office, Tron said he and Dale Carter were roommates. He said he met Carter through Darren Mickle, who was originally from Overtown and played for the San Diego Chargers. At the time they were introduced, Carter was playing for the Kansas City Chiefs. Carter, by then, was a 4-time Pro Bowler and had been voted Rookie of the Year in 1992. Carter had recently purchased a house on Miami Beach, and Tron was living with him. He said they were close friends. Tax records revealed that the house was purchased for $750,000, $1.5 million in today's money. 4 hours after Tron was arrested, Dale Carter showed up at the U.S. Attorney's office with his lawyer. He said he was there to discuss Tron's arrest, so Assistant U.S. Attorney Karen Rockland and Officer Tony interviewed him. According to Carter, he and Tron had been living together in a condo on Collins Avenue for 4 years prior to him purchasing the house on Miami Beach. Tron also lived with him in Kansas City during the football seasons he played for the Chiefs. He said Tron often borrowed his Suburban. While they were talking, Officer Tony noticed that Carter had a For Life tattoo on his neck identical to Tron's. He explained that For Life was the name of a record label he was creating, and that his brother Jake Reed, who played for the New Orleans Saints, and Fred Taylor, who played for the Jacksonville Jaguars, had the same tattoo on their necks, as did Darren Mickle. Carter said he had been traded from the Chiefs to the Broncos, but had been suspended for the entire upcoming season due to an allegation of substance abuse. Carter's son, Nigel Warrior, who was 3 years old at the time of the interview, would grow up to play cornerback for the Seattle Seahawks and the Baltimore Ravens in the NFL. Tron was eventually convicted of all the firearms charges and sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. After bonding with Ra at his confession, he contacted Officer Tony regularly with information. One day he called the homicide office and said that they needed to speak in person, not over the phone. Because he had entered a guilty plea to the murder of Marvin Rogers, he had been transferred from FDC to the Miami-Dade County Jail. Officer Tony set up the interview with the corrections staff and drove there the next day. The only interview room available was by the 5th floor control room near the elevators. It had a large window that faced a glass-enclosed area where the cells on the floor were monitored by 2 jail employees. A uniformed guard brought Ra into the room and removed his handcuffs. The only furniture was a table that was bolted to the floor and 2 chairs. They sat across from each other at the table, and in a low voice, Rara began telling him about a corrections officer who was being paid to smuggle contraband into the jail for several inmates on the third floor. He said the inmates were all members of the John Doe Boys, and that the leader of the gang, Bubba Smith, was paying the CO large sums of money. Rara said the John Doe Boys were planning an escape, and the CO had sold them duplicate keys and pepper spray to aid in the escape. As Officer Tony started scribbling notes onto a yellow legal pad, he was vaguely aware that 5 or 6 inmates had just gotten off the elevator and were walking by the interview room window. He glanced up and saw Rara standing over him with his chair raised over his head. He swung the chair and hit Officer Tony with it on the forehead, just above his left eye. The blow knocked him backwards out of his seat and onto the floor. He covered his head with his arms as Rara continued to batter him with the chair. Luckily, he was wedged into the corner of the room, and many of the intended blows struck the walls. 3 corrections officers rushed into the room, overpowered Rara, and dragged him back to his cell. His head was pounding, and when he touched his forehead, he felt a large lump that was getting bigger by the moment. There was no blood, though. After the cobwebs cleared, Officer Tony completed an arrest affidavit charging Rara with battery on a police officer. The next day, Rara called Officer Tony collect. "Sarge, I'm sorry I had to do you that way, man. There was guys from my floor watching us, and I didn't want them to think I was snitching." Officer Tony was furious. "You could have killed me, you asshole," he exaggerated. "Nah, man, I wouldn't do that. I had to make it look good. I couldn't let them think it was put on. It had to look real." "Well, it felt real," Officer Tony said. "Now you owe me big time. You need to close some murders for me." You're right. I will, I promise." Over the next 2 years, Rara called Officer Tony faithfully and furnished information that would lead to arrests and 5 murders. Officer Tony called Lieutenant Ed Cambridge, who worked internal affairs for the Department of Corrections, and passed on what Rara had told him about the CO who was in league with the John Doe Boys. Internal Affairs set up a sting and caught him red-handed. He was arrested and fired, and the escape plot was foiled. Now that Boobie was finally in custody, the trial for the charge of possession of firearms by a convicted felon could proceed. Boobie and E4 were tried together. Vinny had already been found guilty in Judge King's courtroom. The trial lasted 2 weeks and was held in the courtroom of Judge Patricia Seitz. Both Boobie and E4 were found guilty. Judge Seitz sentenced Boobie to 18 years in federal prison and E4 to 25 years. This took a lot of pressure off the task force. Should they somehow wriggle out of the CCE, they at least knew that they would be off the streets for a long time. The prosecution's case was masterfully presented by Chris Clark. Officer Tony sat in for part of the proceedings and watched as he eviscerated one of Boobie's alibi witnesses. A female friend claimed he was visiting her when the police chased E4 and Vinny. She said Boobie just happens to be mistakenly caught up in the police perimeter. It was an absurd assertion, of course, and Chris's skillful cross-examination tore the alibi apart. Boobie was represented during the court case by Miami defense attorney Neil Namaroff. 2 days after the guilty verdict, he fired Namaroff and named J. Malik Frederick of Atlanta as his lead counsel. Frederick represented Boobie at his bond hearing in Atlanta when he was arrested by the U.S. Marshals. In a strange twist, 1 month after being hired by Boobie, J. Malik Frederick was arrested and charged by the feds with 10 counts of money laundering. The CCE trial was presided over by Judge Michael Moore. Judge Moore had a reputation as a tough law and order jurist. From 1976 to 1989, he served as an assistant United States attorney in both the Northern and Southern districts of Florida. In 1989, he was named the director of the United States Marshal Service and served in that capacity for 4 years. He was appointed to the federal bench in 1991 by President George H.W. Bush and confirmed in February of 1992. Judge Moore oversaw a number of high-profile cases, including the money laundering trial of Miami Dolphins wide receiver Tony Martin. Martin's co-defendant was Opa-locka drug lord Ricky Brownlee. A jury acquitted Martin but found Brownlee guilty, and Judge Moore sentenced him to life in federal prison. Judge Moore also oversaw the parole hearing of Yahweh Ben Yahweh. In 1992, Yahweh Ben Yahweh, whose real name was Hulon Mitchell, was a religious cult leader who was convicted of conspiring to commit 14 murders. Right in the middle of the Boobie Boys trial, Judge Moore was asked to rule on the asylum case of Elian Gonzalez. 6-year-old Elian, his mother, and 12 other refugees left Cuba in a rickety boat, attempting to seek sanctuary in the United States. A storm capsized the boat, and Elian's mother and 10 others drowned. Young Elian was found by fishermen floating in an inner tube off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. In a 50-page opinion, Judge Moore ruled that Gonzalez was too young to file for asylum, and asylum could only be granted by U.S. Attorney Janet Reno. The Boobie Boys were tried in Courtroom 6-1, often referred to as the ceremonial courtroom. It is located in the historic post office and courthouse, which was constructed between 1912 and 1914. It is by far the grandest courtroom in Florida and may be one of the most dazzling in the entire country. It is used for trials, meetings, investitures, educational seminars, chief judge elections, and other important public events. Every current and past judge in the 11th Judicial Circuit has taken his or her oath of office in Courtroom 6-1. Courtroom 6-1 is where Al Capone was acquitted of perjury in 1930, and where Giuseppe Zangara was sentenced to death after attempting to kill Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 at Miami's Bayfront Park. The bullet fired by Zangara, which was intended for President Roosevelt, missed and killed Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak. Candace Mosler and her lover-nephew, accused of killing Mosler's wealthy husband, were also tried in Courtroom 6-1 in 1966. They were acquitted. America's landmark tobacco trial was held in the ceremonial courtroom in the 1990s. 6-1 has been used as the courtroom backdrop in numerous movies and TV shows. Miami-Dade County Circuit Court Judge Scott Silverman explained the mystique this way: "When you get to practice law in this courtroom, everything changes. This is a courtroom." The prosecution's case, put together by Chris Clark, Stacey Levin, and Bruce Brown, was nothing short of brilliant. In today's courtrooms, high-tech projection equipment allows both sides to display exhibits controlled from a laptop on large screens for jurors to view. In some court cases, the judge and each juror even have their own separate monitors, but this technology was not available during the Boobie Boys trial. Chris opted to use 24x30 foam poster boards with photos of people, houses, and businesses printed directly on them. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a printer in the basement of the building that could accommodate such large reproductions. Jeff Lewis spent weeks driving all over Miami-Dade and Broward counties, taking pictures of houses and businesses that were part of the case. Booking photos were used to identify the players. Actual crime scene photographs of the dead victims were also included. Chris and Dave Simmons devised a clever system to retrieve the exhibits quickly when questioning each witness. There were over 300 poster board exhibits, all sequentially numbered. They were stacked in the courtroom in groups of 10. A chart was created that listed the exhibit numbers that would be needed for each witness. Before the witness took the stand, the poster board photos needed for his or her testimony were removed from the stacks. They were quickly replaced when the testimony was over. A witness might be asked, for instance, to identify a particular house where a dope transaction took place from the oversized poster board photos, or a photo of fish grease as the person who sold them crack, or the one-of-a-kind bar where they first met Boobie. This process of seeing witness after witness identify the same enlarged photos over and over simplified the case for the jury. The defense attorneys disliked the presentation, however. E4's attorney complained to the press saying, "All the government has are pictures of heads and houses." The trial was a nightmare for the U.S. Marshals, who were tasked with providing courtroom security. There were 11 defendants along with their lawyers seated at a long L-shaped defense table. Of the original 15 charged in the indictment, Ronald Ray, Bernard Shaw, and Charlton Dacres had already pleaded guilty. Leonard Nard Brown passed away while awaiting trial. Given the violent history of the group, the marshals wanted all the defendants shackled with leg irons and handcuffed. The defense attorneys argued to Judge Moore that shackling and handcuffing their clients in front of the jury would be unfair and prejudicial. Judge Moore wanted to be fair, but he was also concerned about courtroom safety, so he agreed that the defendants' legs would be manacled together, but no handcuffs or restraints would be visible to the jury. A floor-length dark green tablecloth was fastened to the front of the defense table to hide the leg chains. The defendants were always moved in and out of the courtroom, out of the jury's presence. The large gallery of courtroom 6-1 was packed with spectators throughout the trial, many of whom clearly supported the Boobie Boys and looked like a group of thugs spoiling for a fight. Before entering the courtroom, each spectator was required to pass through a metal detector, but the marshals were still concerned. The trial began on February 7th, 2000, and lasted 37 days. The prosecution called 88 witnesses. The testimony presented evidence of the Boobie Boys' involvement in 25 murders, as well as the importation and distribution of over 8,000 pounds of cocaine. Defense attorneys attacked the witnesses as a roguesque gallery of thieves, robbers, and murderers. In his closing argument, attorney Jason Gray, who defended Moose Hawthorne, said the witness list included 50 convicts who have used 500 different names and committed 500 different crimes from obstruction to murder, and they are not believable. Gray, who the task force nicknamed My Cousin Vinny because of his resemblance to Joe Pesci in the movie of the same name, told the jury that many of the witnesses had been bribed by the government with promises of time shaved off their sentences. Life sentences became 15 years. 15 years became 5. 7 became 3. It's like dog years, he fumed. I've never seen anything like it. The most dramatic testimony against my cousin Vinny's client, though, was not from an inmate, but from his own brother. He said that the day after the double murder at the Amico station, he noticed that Moose had cut off his dreadlocks. When he asked him why, Moose replied, "I had to, because of the gas station. Didn't you see the newspaper? We killed that fuck nigga Roger at the gas station. Man, we had those chocolates singing." In his summation to the jury, Chris countered the contention that some of the witnesses had fabricated their testimony by saying, "All a big conspiracy. All the witnesses getting together and making it all up. You cannot make up anything like this." The simple answer is the truth. The government didn't pick these witnesses. The defendants did. They didn't deal with ministers. They didn't deal with judges. These are the people the defendants chose to deal with. The jury began their deliberations on March 15, 2000. When a week passed without a verdict, they began to worry. They all thought the case was a slam dunk. But the task force felt the jury would see it their way and return quickly with a finding of guilty. By the 11th day, with no verdict in sight, they were downright despondent. But when the clerk read each of the 16 counts of the indictment for each defendant, and the foreman repeatedly announced guilty to all of them, you could feel their confidence dissolving. Al Levin, attorney for Wayne Baptiste, spoke to reporters outside the courtroom after the verdicts were read. "We're disappointed," he said. "After 8 days of deliberation, we got a little excited that there was some dissension in the jury room." When it was all over, Officer Tony spoke to 3 of the jurors. They told him that there was never any doubt about the guilt of the defendants. Their first ballot was a unanimous guilty vote on all charges. They were just a meticulous group who wanted to weigh all the evidence carefully. They knew this was a big case, and they didn't want to be accused of rushing to judgment. On the courthouse steps in front of the cameras, Chris, Bruce, and Stacy savored their victory before a gang of reporters. Chris spoke for the group and said, "This was a special case for us because so often you wonder whether you're really making a difference. We have tried and convicted people who have committed more than 15 murders, delivered tons of cocaine, and corrupted a police officer. It feels good." Following the press conference, they all adjourned to the Capitol Grill on Brickell Avenue for a celebratory dinner. What had started out 2 years earlier as the formation of a dubious task force had culminated in a resounding victory with guilty verdicts. This was the biggest case any of them had ever been involved in. None of them had ever worked harder on any investigation, and they were understandably proud of what they had accomplished. 2 months later, Judge Moore sentenced all 14 defendants as follows: Kenneth Boobie Williams, life in federal prison; Ephraim E. Casado, life in federal prison; Leonard O. Brown, life in federal prison; Michael Chico Harper, life in federal prison; Jonathan Moose Hawthorne, life in federal prison; Arthur Plex Pless, life in federal prison; Benjamin Bush Johnson, life in federal prison; Susan Hall Gibson, 30 years in federal prison; Malcolm Rat Shaw, 30 years in federal prison; Wayne Baptiste, 30 years in federal prison; Bernard Shaw, 22 years in federal prison; Marvin Baker, 15 and a half years in federal prison; Ronald Rollo Ray, 5 years in federal prison; Charlton Flav Dacris, 5 years in federal prison. Boobie was already a legend on the streets of Miami, but it took gangster rapper Rick Ross to make him a national legend. As Ross put it, "Street niggas love and respect niggas that make it to the top. Everybody loves a true gangster." Ross was born William Leonard Roberts II and grew up in Carroll City. He attended Carroll City High School, where he played football and hung out at the Matchbox Projects. A football scholarship allowed him to attend Albany State University for 4 years. In the mid-2000s, he began rapping and changed his name to Rick Ross. In 2006, he signed a recording contract with Def Jam Records and toured with Trick Daddy. His debut album, Port of Miami, shot up to number 1 on the Billboard 200. His second album in 2008, Triller, also hit number 1. A track on his third album, Valley of Death, was specifically included to address his controversial stint as a state of Florida corrections officer, something he had tried to keep hidden from the public. Initially, He denied working as a CO and insisted that the photos of him in uniform were photoshopped. But when the evidence became overwhelming, he admitted it. He only held the position for 18 months, but some of his fans cried foul, calling him a fraud and a fake. He tried to justify the job and regain his street cred through his lyrics. Kept a nice watch, smoking on a 100 sack. Back in the day, I sold crack for some nice kicks. Skipping school, I saw my friend stabbed with a nice pick. Can't criticize niggas trying to get jobs. Better get smart, young brother. Live yours. Only lived once and I got 2 kids. And for me to feed them, I'll get 2 gigs. I'll shovel shit, I'll CO, so we can bow our heads and pray over the meatloaf. It's not Shakespeare, but Ross has 3 gold albums and 1 platinum one to his credit. So there are a lot of people who must think he has talent. Many of Ross's songs pay homage to Boobie. The dude that initially put me in the music game is Boobie, he explains. My music touches his lifestyle. Boobie helped a lot of people in the hood and inspired a lot of positive things. The downside to it was that he was accused of over 100 homicides and running a multi-million-dollar drug enterprise. A lot of his lyrics refer directly to Boobie. On Port of Miami, he rapped, "Let me think back to 96, when Boobie had the realest nigga feeling like a bitch." During the intro to Triller, he gave a shout out to Kenneth Williams, a shout out to E4, and a shout out to Fish Grease. In several of his MTV videos, Ross can be seen wearing t-shirts with Boobie Boys written across the front. He said he wears them to honor the crew. Ross claims that his affiliation with the Boobie Boys has inspired most of his music. The stuff I talk about is real. The dope is real. The gun talk is official. Look up Kenneth Boobie Williams. Look up where he's from. That's nothing to be proud of. I wish that on no man. But just to let you know, that's what I witnessed. It's reality. Them niggas was doing their thing. I was just watching. I was a fan of the game. I sat on the porch and watched the Cadillacs go by. The nigga I talk about on my records is Kenneth Boobie Williams. Ross has also honored Boobie with a DVD profiling the top 10 urban gangsters and street legends in Miami. Entitled M.I. Yayo, it features the Boobie Boys, Vonda's Gang, the John Doe Boys, Ricky Brownlee, Bunky Brown, and Isaac Hicks. Ross gives an introductory monologue for each segment, and there are interesting interviews throughout with associates of each group. M.I. Yayo is easy to find on YouTube with a simple search and is definitely worth watching. Through Rick Ross's rap lyrics, Boobie will live on in infamy, but the glorification of the Boobie Boys has not pleased some members of the gang. Michael Chico Harper complained that all the publicity had hurt their chances of winning any type of appeal, saying, "Ross was unconscious of the full effect behind his actions. I know his intentions were good, but it was bad PR for our case. You have niggas still fighting to overturn this shit. It's not a good look when we're arguing the allegations were hyped, distorted, and straight up fabricated. But then a nigga with nationwide exposure is constantly trying to validate it with glory. Hip-hop/rap music and its content is very powerful. It travels beyond the realm of our ghettos." Co-defendant Arthur Plex Pless agreed and said, "Rick Ross is validating what the crackers say by putting it out there. Straight up." This is the end of the Boobie Boys series. And before I end this video, I want to say that I decided to do this story because of the many similarities it has to many of the RICO cases that has been coming forth lately. And for y'all guys to compare that. There are so many more other things you can do to make money for your family and to take care of your family and yourself. Don't throw your life away by choosing the streets. It's a fantasy. And after it's all said and done, you will just be a memory. So keep that in mind, guys, and choose life. Don't choose death. Peace and love.
Treatment.